The FT is reporting that China's recent move to restrict sales of NVIDIA's H20 chip there was due in part to comments by Commerce Secretary Howard Lutnick that Beijing found insulting. In a CNBC interview last month, Lutnick said America doesn't sell China its best stuff or even its second or third best stuff. Looking at NVIDIA shares right now, they're up just about 0.75%.
I mentioned NVIDIA, of course, earnings next week, very important, as our viewers well know. But also a story in the FT, guys, I'm sure you saw it, saying China has turned against NVIDIA AI chips after insulting comments from the Commerce Secretary, Howard Lutnick. And apparently that took place on our air about a month ago. You can take a listen.
We don't sell them our best stuff. Not our second best stuff, not even our third best. I think fourth best is where we've come out that we're cool. So you want to sell the Chinese enough that their developers get addicted to the American technology stack. And that's the thinking.
And that is the thinking, of course, and Jensen Huang shared that thinking successfully with the White House, getting the ban overturned in terms of selling the H20 there. But one of the key questions is going to be whether, in fact, there is significant demand for the H20 or whether there's an ability to replace it with some of the domestically manufactured chips from the likes of Huawei and others. We don't know. There have been reports that they've been pressuring the likes of ByteDance or Alibaba and others who are running large language models to perhaps cut back. And when it comes to inference, where the H20 is obviously quite strong, there may be, Carl, the ability to replace as well there with some of the domestically manufactured chips in China. So the ban overturned, the question becomes, can they return to the same market share they had previous to that? And of course, don't forget, they're going to be paying 15% to the U.S. government from everything that's sold.
Right. There is this lingering notion that the Chinese are simply trying to buy time for their own technology to make another stand, whether that's Huawei or DeepSeek in AI. But it's a concern that especially among China hawks, that they're trying to play us.
Without a doubt. Yeah. And difficult to measure, certainly for us. Rely on certain experts. But there's no doubt that the Chinese are not far. Well, they may not be ahead, but they aren't far behind. And again, you're dealing with different ways to measure. They do have a lot more open source. And inference, obviously, is going to become more and more important as the training models sort of not fade in importance, but are less important, I guess. So we'll see. And not to mention so many of the other things that will go into the AI economy. Power, starting there. People who go to China now are like, you can't even imagine what they've got in terms of the ability to build new sources of energy, whether it's nuclear, whether it is solar, and everything else that goes along with it. So, and that's going to be obviously the gating issue here in the United States.
The Financial Times out with a front page report today claiming that China turned against NVIDIA's AI chip after what Beijing's bosses claimed were, quote, insulting remarks from Commerce Secretary Howard Lutnick. Now, the comments are actually over a month old. We should know because they were made to us in our interview with the Commerce Secretary in Pittsburgh on July 15th. Looking at NVIDIA getting a deal to be allowed to sell certain chips and do more business into China. That's coming from this administration. Is that a change of heart?
Well, it's funny because the Biden administration allowed China to buy these chips last year. So then we held it up, and then in the magnets deal with the Chinese, we told them that we would start to resell them. So remember, these are an older chip. Biden had them available, and we rethought it. But now that NVIDIA came out with their newest chip, you realize the newest chip is called the Blackwell. Then they have the H20 and H100. This is like the fourth one down. So the fourth one down, we want to keep China using it. We want to keep having the Chinese use the American technology stack because they still rely upon it, and that's key. So we try to play that balance. We don't sell them our best stuff, not our second best stuff, not even our third best. I think fourth best is where we've come out that we're cool.
So China's leadership reportedly upset about that. And there is some concern that frustration in the Communist Party could come back to bite NVIDIA or maybe its investors. Let's broaden this all out and talk about it. Joining us now to discuss, CNBC's NASDAQ reporter, Christina Partsenevelos, along with Bernstein semiconductor analyst Stacy Rasgon. First off, Christina, to you, it seems a little bit much ado about nothing, but they're upset. Do NVIDIA investors have to be worried?
Your interview was great, and they noticed it, so hats off to you. But a lot of this could be perceived as noise because we have for some time seen headlines that Beijing officials have been pushing back, telling large companies like Alibaba and ByteDance to scale back their orders of H20s. These are chips specifically made for China, or even to stop them altogether. Why? Because they want Chinese companies to rely on homegrown options, for example, like Huawei. So this is another example to get them riled up and show that they're, really pushing back, and NVIDIA is not going to be, the go-to anymore. Huawei should be the go-to. However, it seems
What else would they buy?
Huawei's Ascend chips, but they're not the same.
They're not as good.
The performance is not as good when we're talking about computational power, but they're much cheaper and localized. So, and I know Stacy can get more into the details in terms of the nitty-gritty with that, but there is an argument to be made, and we can see it with DeepSeek. DeepSeek large language models, an AI startup in China doing really well with Huawei chips and NVIDIA chips. So it's an opportunity for them to crack the whip again. And so what does this mean for Chinese revenue for NVIDIA next Wednesday?
And that's Stacy Rasgon. That's it. And first off, the interview is just over a month old. So the story was a little bit vexing to me. But, hey, let's talk about it, because is there a risk in the numbers? Would NVIDIA sell China fewer chips because they're, quote, insulted by those comments?
Well, you have to remember, right now in the numbers, China is zero, right?
He's
clearly not using the latest NVIDIA chip
he's not using
in that Zoom processor. There's times when things freeze on the air, and I'm like, is that me? Like, am I freezing? So we're going to try to get Stacy Rasgon back. But to his point, it's a zero now, so you can be insulted. But if you want these chips, you're going to buy them. And China's, listen, they're a smart country. They're not going to think that we're going to give them the absolute best that we've got.
No.
Are they?
No, they're not going to think that. To Stacy's point, he was just talking about the revenue. So last quarter, China contributed $4.6 billion, which was still a little bit over almost 13% of total revenues. The assumption is that the H20 ban was put in this quarter and then lifted, so they weren't actually shipping chips to China. They just got their green light very recently. And the problem with that is, how do you calculate that into total revenues going forward? And so that's the big question for earnings next Wednesday. Are these H20 chips that were sitting, work in progress, are they going to be able to ship out very soon? Have they been shipping out? What's the quantity? So you have mixed results coming from various sell-side research. Like, for example, at Wedbush, I was just reading, he thinks that the contribution is going to be actually much smaller, whereas other people think it's going to be a tailwind in the next 3 quarters.
So Stacy Rasgon, I believe we have him back. He has upgraded his chips. I'm now thinking about a great 80s book and movies, Less Than Zero. Is this going to have a negative impact on a zero number for NVIDIA?
Yeah, again, right now in the numbers, it is zero going forward. I don't think at least the sell side has broadly started to put China back yet. And even if they are free to sell, it would take some time to actually get into the numbers. They have to ramp up the supply chain again. You're not going to see any this quarter. It'd be very little next quarter. Maybe you get into the end of the year, maybe, but it's not that much in the numbers. And, the stock's been a little weaker recently. I'm not sure how much it is in expectations yet either. I think people are sort of just, it's a waiting game. I'm
sure, Stacy, you hear about it, and a lot of people may, if they don't subscribe to the Financial Times, are thinking, what are you talking about? Well, to cover the Financial Times, as much as you can have a cover these days on the internet, we get it, is basically this story about how Beijing is offended about those comments that we just showed. You're rolling your eyes, and I get it, because I kind of also wonder why the story is out. Yeah. The comments are a month old, but I'm sure you've heard about it.
I've heard about it. And look, I think China has reasons to want to stimulate demand of their local parts. And frankly, I don't think they need to be insulted in order to go down that path. That's the path they're going down. The issue is the local parts are not as good. Frankly, they perform okay, because NVIDIA's got one arm tied behind their back in terms of the thresholds to which they can ship in terms of performance. But NVIDIA has ecosystem and software compatibility. The Chinese have basically built their whole AI infrastructure around NVIDIA. So regardless of what China says or suggests, at least where I take some solace is there is demand for the NVIDIA parts. They want to buy them. In fact, you even mentioned DeepSeek. There's been some rumors about DeepSeek, R2 delay, because they were trying to go to Huawei, and it turns out it's actually not as easy to use those parts. They want to use NVIDIA. We'll see what they're allowed to do or not. But in terms of the actual numbers for NVIDIA, I don't think there's much, at least in the forward numbers anyway. So anything they can get, I
Brian,
think is all right.
you were saying that it is a month old, but it's a part of the narrative that Beijing has been pushing for quite some time, that they are going to become self-sufficient. There was another article from the Nikkei. They're reporting saying that, for example, Shanghai is promising to be 100% self-sufficient by 2027. Beijing, 70% self-sufficient. So when you have all of these municipalities working together, perhaps it'll be a more cohesive movement. And out in the limelight and media, us talking about it, it's showing that they're, backing down from NVIDIA. But behind closed doors, there are other reports saying that those purchases are still happening. The H20s are so important because they provide such great computational power, even if they're the third or fourth tier version, as Howard Lutnick pointed out.
I think, Stacy, Rasgon, in your comments, were you kind of implying, and I hope you know what I mean by the term locker room material, right? When two teams are playing and the one team is like, that team is soft. And then that team puts that up in the locker room so all the players get angry and they go out there and win the game. Do you think that's kind of what China is trying to do? Stimulate that domestic thing by basically saying, they're insulting us, so we need to do better?
I mean, I don't know if they're saying that or not, right? But clearly they do want to do better. They want to be self-sufficient. We're not seeing this just on the AI side, right? We see this in analog. We're seeing it in semi-cap, right? There's a big push in China for self-sufficiency across the board because they have no choice, right? The U.S. has shown that we have the ability to squeeze them off, like if we want to, because we control most of that IP. They have to be more self-sufficient. They have no choice, and it will take time, but they're going to put effort in regardless. It doesn't mean that the U.S. guys can't sell or that there won't be demand for the U.S. parts, so there clearly is. But China's going to do what they can.
Before we go to Christina, final comment from you. You're not taking down any NVIDIA estimates or price targets on this story?
I don't have any China in my numbers right now.
No, we can't. Less than zero. There we go. But remember, Stacy, Rasgon, appreciate it. Thank you very much. Christina, wrap it up with this. I do want to remind our viewers of a big story that I think Christina Partsinevelos talked about a few months ago, which was, remember that whole story about smuggling NVIDIA chips to Singapore?
In pregnancy bellies.
Literally
lobsters,
pregnancy bellies,
and then
big lobsters, boxes, cars, whatever it took. You do wonder if China's still buying NVIDIA chips, just maybe not, directly. I'm trying to be
NVIDIA will
politically correct.
Deny that it's landing
it's not
in
there.
China.
By the way, it wouldn't be NVIDIA's fault at all.
And then the argument...
You sell it to somebody in Malaysia or Singapore. You don't know what they're going to do with it.
Yes, but the argument is you can't do very much with these individual chips because you need the entire stack, you need the software, you need the servicing. However, you can do a little bit with just the chips if you're a startup, if you're, a very small organization. And we saw even with the DeepSeek article, FT talking about using the Huawei chip for inference and the NVIDIA chip for training shows that there is some compatibility going forward. And I think that's the scary part for NVIDIA, the fact that Huawei is still being used on the important level of inferencing, which is to spit out answers to your questions, your queries after it's been trained on a
Where's
model.
DeepSeek right now? Where does it stop? We got to go, but where is DeepSeek?
So there's DeepSeek, a version, and V3, which is just put out today, but the next R2 model was supposed to come out. There's some, there's all this rumors about timeline. It's delayed, all this because of the NVIDIA, the not getting the NVIDIA chips and then the Huawei chips failing. So you just need to know China is very advanced with a lot of their large language models, open source models. Many of them are coming from China, the ones that are getting downloaded because they're open source. And so that is a threat to the United States when you have China showing such strength in AI.
Well, got to ask you about NVIDIA. They report next week. Listen, it's always been fun to say it's peaked. Some headlines today about Howard Lutnick in China. And all. There's always a negative headline when it comes to NVIDIA, but you still like it here.
They can't make the processors fast enough, and as soon as everybody else catches up to their current one, they have the next one coming out. If they catch up to the Blackwell, they got the Rubin coming out.
Yeah, who would at this point bet against, right? I mean, you can't bet against Jensen. Not long ago, there was this notion that there's no way you could get the money back. You remember this, June 2024, the $600 billion question. Yeah, they're investing all of this money, but they will never get it back. And that put a lot of pressure, right? The AI bubble, this is ironically from Sequoia. And I think it's interesting because reading your notes, you think this is actually one of the reasons to buy these stocks, the value proposition of all the money they're investing in this stuff.
Yeah, I mean, look, it's easy to call this a bubble. I mean, stocks, a lot of them are priced to perfection. The market's trading right below all-time highs. You're getting day after day highs here. And we've been talking about this quote-unquote AI bubble. I like to call that, a news headline in search of news, right?
Right.
Because the fact is that, these markets do have a lot of room to grow. This is just the very early stages. These are the very beginnings of this expansion at this point. And so, of course, not all companies are the same. Clearly, some companies haven't been able to get a return on that investment just yet. But the ones that we're heavily focused on now, the ones that have been doing all the pulling in the market over the last 6 months, those are companies that are already getting return on those investments. We see them.
And you've got strong conviction there. It's sort of a line that you had. It reminds me of a line that when I was a broker, we get on the phone like, hey, Mr. Jones, yeah, the stock is down, but if you liked it at 20, you'll love it at 10. Let's buy some more. If you have conviction in a stock when it's expensive, you should like it even more when it's cheap. But this also means that you have to kind of understand what you own now.
Absolutely, right? So, it's very easy on the surface to say, oh, this stock is expensive. But you have to recognize that a lot of the models that we build on the valuations of these stocks, they're looking 1 or 2 years out, right? So I'm very fortunate in that we can look long-term 4, 5, 10 years out. Not everyone has that time frame.
Right.
But if you do, and you can hold on for that time frame, you'll see that just slight changes in the growth trajectory significantly change the valuation of a stock.
How does this play into the overall thesis with NVIDIA? We've been through different versions of the story with NVIDIA, of course. One, it was massive supply constraints. They can't make it fast enough. Now it's each generation getting better. The sustainability of the AI theme. Where does China fit into all that?
So I think it's important when we talk about what the White House is doing. It's not 15% of just sales, of like NVIDIA sales, it's of China sales. And so I think that's a win for NVIDIA, and I guess AMD as well, because they were going to be totally banned, right? They already wrote off the H20 last quarter. So I think for NVIDIA, having 85% of the revenues from China is way better than the alternative of a complete ban. I think you have to take a step back. I mean, this is a $4.3 trillion market cap that come next week is going to deliver plus 50% revenue growth, plus I think it's 43% earnings growth. It's really just rarefied air. And so, I mean, I don't see any company ever in history having this type of consistent, very high double-digit revenue and earnings growth. So, I mean, I just think NVIDIA continues to be, once again, in pole position versus all of their peers.
No, it's fair to say that no company at that scale of revenue has ever grown quite that fast. I mean, this year we're talking about, 130 billion or thereabouts in revenue.
And let's start right there. Why the hike to the price target?
Yeah, I mean, I think there's a couple of reasons. You mentioned one of them. Certainly, there should be some revenue from China, and we can debate whether it's $1 billion or $8 billion. I think I've been relatively conservative there, but the other pieces are, look, my checks throughout the quarter have been positive. Hearing good things about Blackwell Ultra. You look at the CSPs; they're lifting spend. They've been the single largest market for NVIDIA. So you've had a bunch of good news. NVIDIA tends to leave a little bit on the table when they give guidance. And so I just don't see any reason that we don't get another beat and then another strong guide for fiscal Q3.
So the fact that the stock has sold off in these last couple of days, is that a buying opportunity ahead of the print then?
I think that everything looks good for NVIDIA. It's always hard to tell exactly how it will trade around the print, but I think the concerns kind of this week have more to do with macro, maybe a bit about the future of AI, given that MIT paper that said something like only 5% of enterprises are really getting value from generative AI. But I think that there is plenty of spend ahead, not only the CSPs, but sovereigns. And so I think NVIDIA is looking good through 2026 at least.
Okay, so in light of that, what do you think of that MIT paper? And then I know there was also there was the Sam Altman AI bubble commentary, which was arguably taken a little bit out of context as well. What do you make of all of that and what it means for the future of spending on AI?
Yeah, so I think part of it is simply figuring out how to use the tech. And to some extent, it's a positive that 5% of enterprises are getting real value out of this, right? That suggests that it's not useful to the other 95% of enterprises, but rather that They just need to figure out how to use generative AI. I think that there's a ton of consumer devices coming out in 26, 27 that are aimed at trying to enable AI for the consumer. So again, something else that will use data center resources. And the tough thing is to figure out exactly when you see that viral application, if you will. But having said that, because we have all this sovereign spend that gets layered on top of the CSP spend, I think there's 18 months for that event to happen before we have to worry that, maybe spend on data center falls short of expectations.
I want to go back to the China piece for NVIDIA specifically, because if I'm recalling correctly, in the last couple of quarters, they basically de-risked the China business, and a lot of that was pulled out of the forecast and the guidance. So do you expect that to be layered back in now, given what we're seeing with these H20 chips, even if there is a 15% cut of sales going back to the U.S. government?
Yeah, so I think there's going to be some revenue from China. I think the real question is, look, NVIDIA was set to do $8 billion in Q2, or at least that's what management thought they were going to do. What's the real level right now? You've got headwinds from that 15%, the export tariff, if you will. You have the Chinese government pushing its companies not to use the H20, but NVIDIA is still going to see some revenue from China. And the real question is it $2 billion? Is it $4 billion? I've been relatively conservative in layering it in. So I only have $1 billion, $2 billion over the next couple of quarters, a little more than that next year when you start to get the Blackwell parts out. But I think it's still a benefit versus where we'd been a quarter ago when it looked like China was going to be zero.
All right, I hope you're all doing great today. I want to cover multiple news stories, including the latest NVIDIA China news. Then I want to cover the Meta AI story. Then I'll address the worries of an AI bubble because I'm still seeing people talk about it. And then I'll share some of my long-term thoughts about NVIDIA's future after that. So the Financial Times is reporting that Chinese authorities are looking for ways to force Chinese companies away from buying NVIDIA H20s following what they consider to be, quote, insulting comments from Commerce Secretary Lutnick last month. I will be completely honest. I don't think this news changes anything for NVIDIA. The reality is that Chinese companies are still heavily reliant on NVIDIA's full stack offerings because of NVIDIA's CUDA software platform. This is why, even though Huawei has some competitive offerings on the hardware side, NVIDIA's H20 is still the preferred option for many developers in China. For example, it was recently reported that DeepSeek tried developing their new R2 model using chips from Huawei in an attempt to not be reliant on NVIDIA. And now it's reported that the release of that model is delayed. This report also underscores the importance of NVIDIA software offerings, and it's why I honestly think China will continue buying from NVIDIA for the foreseeable future. We may see some things said publicly in this back and forth trade dispute between the US and China. But ultimately, at this present moment, China needs NVIDIA chips in order to stay in the AI race, and there's no way around this fact. Now, I'll briefly mention the Meta AI news that's been getting a lot of attention recently, because we have a headline from the Wall Street Journal that does not tell the full story. Last night on X, Meta's Andy Stone posted saying that the Wall Street Journal did not include the statement Meta provided to them, wherein Meta says that all that is happening here is some basic organizational planning. Andy says that all that's happening is a temporary pause on some hiring while Meta does some planning and forecasting, which they do regularly, and a structure for their new superintelligence efforts after they brought a number of new people on board. So Meta is definitely not stepping back from AI, not at all. They're simply making some organizational changes. That's it. I'm also very quickly going to mention the talk about an AI bubble again, because unfortunately I've noticed that it's still getting a lot of attention even after OpenAI's CFO went on CNBC yesterday and clarified Sam's previous comments. So recently OpenAI Sam Altman essentially said that he thinks we're in a period where investors are overexcited about AI, but he also thinks that AI is the biggest era ever, bigger than the internet, mobile, cloud, etc. Then it was reported that Sam thinks we are in an AI bubble. Then OpenAI CFO went on CNBC and clarified that Sam thinks AI is huge and OpenAI is moving full speed ahead in light of extremely strong demand. At the same time, Sam thinks that investments in some AI companies will not pan out the way investors hope, and therefore investors should be more selective in which AI companies they invest in. I think this is reasonable. Also, I do not think that we are anywhere near a bubble bursting type of event, not even close. This AI revolution is fundamentally different from the dot-com era in multiple key areas. First, the largest spenders are extremely well capitalized with extremely strong balance sheets. Second, the biggest spenders are not aimlessly investing in AI infrastructure in the hopes of eventually finding a use case for it. Rather, they already have multiple use cases for it, and they're struggling to meet very strong demand from their paying customers. Third, the largest AI spenders are funding their AI investments with their own earnings. This was not the case during the dot-com era. Fourth, the development of new use cases and mass public adoption of the technology is going to happen substantially faster than it did during the early days of the internet, because the internet is already here. We don't have to wait 10 or 20 years for it to happen. Instead, it's already happening at this very moment, reducing the risk of long digestion periods like what we saw in the early days of the internet. Those are just some of the reasons why the current AI revolution is different from the early days of the internet. Will there eventually be an overbuild of capacity? Probably at some point, but I think we are at the very least 3 to 5 years away from something like that happening. And even then, I think there will still be long-term growth potential on the other side of any digestion period that may occur during that time frame. So in summary, I think the talks about there being an AI bubble at this point are largely overblown. AI demand is extremely strong based on what we've heard from all of the hyperscalers on their most recent earnings calls. I think we are about to see a surge in compute demand fueled by the introduction of agentic AI to the general public. I think this surge in compute demand will extend well into 2026. And I also think that 2026 will be another growth year for NVIDIA. I heard someone just this morning saying that NVIDIA is overvalued. And I just want to remind you all that while valuation is an important factor to consider, it is not the sole determinant of whether or not a stock is worth owning. If you solely focus on valuation, you will miss every single transformational tech shift: internet, mobile, cloud, AI, quantum, and so on. Valuation is important to consider, don't get me wrong, but you also have to consider earnings growth and forward growth potential. On that note, one of the things I really like about NVIDIA is that they give us great visibility of what to expect even 3 years in advance. The reason they do this is because there's a lot of infrastructure that has to be put in place in order to support each new generation of NVIDIA's data center products. As a result, we have a clear data center product roadmap extending into 2028 with a new generation product release each year. Blackwell Ultra has launched and should ramp substantially in September. Then in 2026, we have Vera Rubin with the Vera CPU being NVIDIA's first custom CPU containing 88 NVIDIA Olympus cores. And NVIDIA recently said in a statement to CNBC that Rubin is on track. Then in 2027, we have Rubin Ultra with a single Kyber rack containing 576 Rubin GPU dies. That is 4 times as many GPU dies as the current Blackwell systems. And then we have Feynman after that in 2028. Jensen believes the world's computing CapEx will reach $1 trillion annually by 2030, meaning he's expecting an expanding total addressable market and growing AI demand underpinning all of this. I seriously think we are still in the early days of AI, and I genuinely think that NVIDIA still has a lot of runway ahead of it. I think NVIDIA will be worth substantially more in future years than it is today. At least that's my view of the situation. Remember to stay calm in this market. Remember to maintain a long-term perspective, and do not make any hasty or irrational decisions. With all of that being said, I hope you all have a great rest of the day, and I'm curious to hear your thoughts about NVIDIA in the comments below. Please leave a like on this video so more people will see it. And while you're down there, please consider subscribing. It's free, and you can always change your mind. Thanks for watching, and hopefully I'll see you in the next video.